Shalom Havrim, James Trim here, and want to share with you today some understanding of Romans chapter 10, verse 4. We covered this several years ago in our Through the Book of Romans videos, but I'm going to cover it in a little bit more detail today. There is a set of handouts for today's video, and you can download the PDF and print it out. There is a link in the video description to the PDF where you can download the handouts to follow along and have the notes for this study. Before we get going, I do want to encourage people to please donate to support this work. These videos, this material is, I think you'll find unique, and the videos that you'll find here are unique, and we depend on donations from people like you to make it happen. Donations this month have been quite low for, frankly, the last 2 months, and we are really trying to get caught up. So please make a donation if you can. There is you can donate by sending donations to donations at wnae.org. That's donations at wnae.org via PayPal, or you can click on the link in the video description to donate. Also, be sure to like these videos, subscribe, and share these videos with others on social media like Facebook, etc. Okay, so we're dealing with a difficult, so-called difficult passage. It's really not that difficult, as you'll find as we get into this. In Romans chapter 10, verse 4, where the King James Version reads, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth," Romans 10:4 KJV. And most of your typical Christian translations read somewhat similar to that. And I want to deal with this idea that this passage is saying that Messiah is the end of the law. That the law is just done, over with, after the Messiah came, which is a false theology, and this is one of the passages that false theology seeks to support itself with. Now, looking at the Greek version of Romans, the Greek word for end here is telos, and that Greek word telos does not always indicate a termination. It appears 42 times in the Greek New Testament, and in some of those it does indicate a termination, 4 or 5 of them, but in the majority it does not. And in several places, it indicates an outcome, a result, or culmination, like in 1 Timothy 1:5 or 1 Kepha chapter 1, verse 9. Kepha is Peter, 1 Peter 1:9, for those of you unaware of that. And if Christians want to claim that the Torah has ceased based on the Greek word telos for end in Romans chapter 10, verse 4, then they should also argue that faith and salvation have ceased based on the use of the same Greek word telos for end in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 9. Clearly, an argument that proves too much proves nothing at all. The Aramaic word that appears in the Aramaic Peshitta version of Romans, chapter 10, verse 4, for the word that we normally, or I say, that's commonly translated to end, is the Aramaic word sakah, Samik Kaf He. And that word has similar ambiguity to the Greek word telos. It can mean end in the sense of termination, but it can also mean end in the sense of culmination, in the sense of aim or goal, just as telos can mean aim or goal. In fact, in Murdoch's 19th century translation of the Peshitta, Syriac Peshitta, his spelling, or Peshitta, is a marginal note to this word end in Romans 10:4, which transliterates the Aramaic word sakah in the margin, and it offers the translation aim. Or maybe it translates it aim. No, it actually offers a marginal note saying that the word could be translated aim. There's also a biblical Hebrew word, Strong's 8503, taklit, and that word also has the same ambiguity. Looking back also at this word sakah in Aramaic, one of the things that I like to do in my studies of the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, commonly known as the so-called New Testament, is I like to take the Aramaic text of the Peshitta and Old Syriac, and I like to look back, take the Aramaic words, and look and see how the Talmud and the Targums, and even the Zohar, use the same Aramaic words. And interestingly, the word sakah is used in the Talmud to mean sum total. So the idea of culmination or summation or sum total, like equals. Okay, one passage refers to the sum total of the number of students in a class, and the word for sum is sakah. So this passage could be understood that Messiah, not that he's the end of the law or the termination of the law, but that Messiah is the end or the aim or goal of the Torah. But it also could even be understood to mean that Messiah is not only the culmination of the Torah, but literally that the Messiah is the sum total of the Torah, or that the Messiah equals the Torah, that the Messiah and the Torah have an equivalence. So let's turn to the next page in our handouts. All that was covered on the first page of our handouts. So page 2 of our handouts goes on to verses 5 through 8. And reading from the KJV here because I am responding to the antinomian Christians that are using the KJV or similar translations. So verses 5 through 8 are going to demonstrate that in fact Paul was saying that the Messiah is the sum total of the Torah, or that the Messiah is the Torah. So in Romans chapter 10, verses 5 through 8, we read, "For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth these things shall live by them. But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise, say not in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven, that is, to bring Christ down from above, or who shall descend into the deep, that is, to bring up Christ again from the dead. But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart, that is, the word of faith which we preach." So there's a few things to observe about these verses. First of all, The first word in verse 6, the KJV translates but. However, both in the Greek and in the Aramaic, the first word in verse 6 should actually be and. It's very important to notice here that contrary to common misinterpretation, Romans 10 here is not contrasting the righteousness which is of faith in verse 6 with the righteousness which is of the law in verse 5. That's not what's happening here. And therefore the word but does not belong here. In fact, it should be the word and, because there's actually this culmination building that the righteousness which is of the law is the righteousness which is of faith. It can't be contrasting because in making the case, then the passage here is contrasting the Torah, is not contrasting these two things, because the two passages that are being compared are both from the Torah. It's comparing Leviticus 18:5, he who does these things shall live by them, with Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14, which we're going to look at in depth. So Paul here is comparing a passage from the two passages from the Torah. And so if both the righteousness which is of the Torah and the righteousness which is of faith are each being represented by passages from the Torah and compared with one another, he can't be contrasting the Torah with the Torah. So he is comparing the Torah with the Torah to show that they're the same, that the righteousness of faith is the righteousness which is of the Torah. And we're going to find that as we also then are good Bereans. So in Acts chapter 17, Paul was teaching the Bereans, and it says that the Bereans were searching the scriptures to see if the things that he said were true. And so Paul said that they were more noble than any of the other people that he had taught, because they were checking the scriptures to see if what he said was true. Now, what scriptures did they have? Well, obviously the Tanakh were the only scriptures that they had at that time. The books of the so-called New Testament, the Ketuvim Netzarim, hadn't been written yet. They were still in the process of being written. And Paul didn't respond, "What are you looking at old wineskins for new wine for? Wait till I write the book of Romans, or wait till I write the book of Ephesians," or whatever. No, he didn't say that. He said that they were more noble than anyone else because they were checking the Tanakh to judge the things that he was saying. So I'm going to ask you to be good Bereans, and what we're going to do in our next handout is we're going to look at the scriptures to see if what Paul says is true, to understand what Paul is saying in context of the passage that he's actually quoting here from in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And we're going to start in verse 9, and we'll read through verse 16. And that is our next handout, titled Looking at the Torah. "And Yahweh your Elohim will make you overabundant in all the work of your hand, and in the fruit of your body, and in the fruit of your cattle, and in the fruit of your land, for good. For Yahweh will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers." Verse 10, "If you shall hearken to the voice of Yahweh your Elohim, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the Torah, if you turn unto Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, for this commandment that I command you this day is not too hard for you, neither is it far off." There are those that say, "Oh, the Torah is too hard." But this says, actually, it's not too hard. Elohim's not a liar. He says it's not too hard. Verse 12, it is not in heaven that you should say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it unto us and make us to hear it that we may do it. Sound familiar? This is what Paul was quoting from. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us and make us to hear it that we may do it. But the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. See, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil, in that I command you this day to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways and keep his commandments and his statutes and his ordinances. Then you shall live and multiply, and Yahweh your Elohim shall bless you in the land where you go in to possess it. Now, there's some very important things to see here. The most important is that you'll notice that in Romans chapter 10, when Paul quotes verses 12 through 13, actually through 14 really, but when he's quoting verses 12 and 13, verses 12 and 13 are clearly talking about the Torah. When it says it's not up in heaven that it should be brought down to you. It's not beyond the sea that someone would have to go over the sea to bring it to you. It is the Torah that is being spoken of. That's very important because in Romans chapter 10, Paul says he's talking about the Messiah, that to bring Messiah down from above, to bring a Messiah again from the dead, and so on. That the Messiah is what's being spoken of here. So he quotes these passages, but he substitutes Messiah when in context of verse 10, this is very clearly speaking about the book of the Torah and the commandments and the statutes that are written in the book of the Torah. Okay? So this tells us that in Romans 10:4, when Paul says the Messiah is the end of the Torah, he means Sakah in Aramaic. He means that Messiah is the sum total of the Torah, and then he's going to go on to quote these passages of Torah to make his case that Messiah and the Torah are one. And we're going to look at these verses a little bit in more detail here in a minute, but that I just mentioned, verses 12 and 13. But I want to move on to verse 14 in the Torah, in Devarim chapter 30, verse 14. But the word is very near unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. The word here in verse 14 is, again, in context of verse 10, the Torah, the book of the Torah. The commandments and statutes written in the book of the Torah. That's the word that's near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 14. That's very important because then if we look back at Romans chapter 10, verse 8, but what says it? The word is near you, even in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. That is referencing verse 14, chapter 30, verse 14 in context, right? And that means that the word of faith that Paul is proclaiming, that he says is near you, even in your mouth and in your heart, that Paul is saying that we proclaim, in other words, Paul and his cohorts proclaim, is in context the commandments and statutes which are written in the book of the Torah, from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 14, in light of chapter 30, verse 10. It's right here. If Paul is not completely twisting Scripture out of context, he is saying here that the word of faith that he's running around proclaiming with, and he and his cohorts are running around and proclaiming, the word of faith that he speaks of is in fact the commandments and statutes written in the book of the Torah. And he is saying that that is identifiable, is the same as the Messiah. The Messiah is the incarnation of that book of the Torah. And like I said, we're going to look at that here more in a minute. But then I want to look at something very important, and that is this phrase, who will ascend into heaven, which is verse 12. Verse 12 in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 12 in our handout. And I actually put the Hebrew for this phrase down at the bottom for you. And that is, according to Romans 10, the Messiah, and according to Deuteronomy chapter 30, the Torah. By the way, this idea that the Torah and the Messiah are the same can also be derived in many ways. In the Tanakh, we learn in various passages that the Torah is the way, the truth, the life, the light, and the word. And in the book of Yochanan, we also read about the Messiah, that the Messiah is the way, the truth, the light, the life, and the word. The Messiah is the Torah, and the Torah is the Messiah. So the Messiah is the sum total of the Torah. The Messiah is the Torah. The Torah is the Messiah. And this is the word of faith that Paul is proclaiming in Romans 10:8. Okay, so going back then, looking back at the bottom of our handout, the Hebrew for the phrase, who will ascend into heaven, if I've written it out in Hebrew here for you, if we take the first letter of each word, which is called notarikon, it's a method of interpretation. It's a method of interpretation of the Hebrew of the Torah and the Tanakh called notarikon in Judaism, where we find hidden messages in the Torah. And there is a hidden message here using notarikon. If we take the first letter of each word, it spells milah. Milah is one of the Hebrew words for word. And then if we take the last letter, and you'll see that I wrote it out with the first letter of each word in red. And then if we take the same phrase, who will ascend into heaven, and we take the last letter of each word, it spells Yud-He-Vav-He, Yahweh. So we have Milah, Yahweh, the word of Yahweh, embedded in this text. So we have this secret message, if you will, that that this who that will ascend into heaven is the Milah Yahweh, the word of Yahweh. Okay. Now, where does Paul get this idea that this thing that is spoken of in verses 12 and 13 of Deuteronomy 30 is the, we know it's the Torah, okay, but Paul is making a usage of it where he identifies this book of the Torah with the Messiah. Okay, so let us now look at the apocryphal book of Baruch. And Baruch is a book that was written by Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch. And it's very clear when we look at everything in context here that, contrary to those that want to say that Paul never uses the Apocrypha or that the scriptures never quote the Apocrypha, etc., that Paul is actually very much making use of the book of Baruch in his interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 9 through 16, that he's presenting in Romans chapter 10, verses 5 through 8. In the book of Baruch, chapter 3, verses 29 through 30, it says, "Who has gone into heaven and taken her?" It's speaking of in context of wisdom. If you look through all of chapter 3 of Baruch, it's talking about Chachma, Hebrew, wisdom. "Who has gone up into heaven and taken her," or wisdom, "and brought her down from the clouds? And who is," verse 30, "who has gone over the sea and found her and will buy her for pure gold?" Now you can't read this. If you're familiar with Torah, very familiar with, if you understand, you're familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 30 and the passages that we just looked at in Deuteronomy 30, it's very clear that Baruch is referring back here to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 12 and 13. Then a few verses down in chapter 3, verse 37, and then chapter 4, verse 1. And remember, these chapter divisions and verse divisions were introduced by monks later. They weren't original to the text. So this chapter division really doesn't belong here. It kind of interrupts the continuity. Verse 37, "Afterward she appeared upon earth and lived among men." Who is she? This wisdom. Okay? "She appeared upon earth and lived among men. She is the book of the commandments of Elohim and the Torah that endures forever. All who hold fast and live with those, and those who forsake her fast will die." And this is referring back again to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 10. Okay, with this idea that the what's being spoken of coming down, not having to be brought down from heaven or brought over the sea, is the book of the Torah. The commandments and statutes which are written in the book of the Torah, or as we read in chapter 4, verse 1 of Baruch, she, with this wisdom that is being spoken of, is the book of commandments of Elohim and the Torah that endures forever. And then it says, all who hold fast will live, and those who forsake her fast will die. And that is, of course, in reference to verses 15 and 16 of Deuteronomy 30. So it's very clear here that Baruch is here referring back to the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and is personifying the Torah and saying that this personification of the Torah, he speaks prophetically, appears upon earth and lives among men. It's very clear that Paul has exactly this usage of Deuteronomy 30 by Baruch, and Paul is referring in Romans 10 verses 5 through 8 partly to Deuteronomy chapter 30 verses 9 through 16 in light of Baruch's interpretation of that passage of Torah in Baruch chapter 3 verse 29 through 30, in verse 37 through chapter 4 verse 1. So here we see also that Paul is using the Apocrypha. He's using the book of Baruch. Paul is using the apocryphal book of Baruch. There's no question about that. And he's doing all of this to use the Torah to make the argument that the Torah is the Messiah and the Messiah is the Torah. Therefore, the Messiah is the sum total of the Torah in Romans 10:4. So he makes this bold statement in Romans 10:4 that Messiah is the sum total of the Torah, the sakah, the sum total of the Torah. And then he makes that case by quoting two passages of Torah, and particularly by quoting Deuteronomy chapter 30, and interpreting Deuteronomy chapter 30 in light of Baruch chapter 3 and 4. And our next handout then, I just thought to kind of shed some light on this. So I want to look at a passage from the Midrash Rabbah. And the purpose of this passage in Midrash Rabbah 1:5, which is our next handout, the Torah as a living entity in the Midrash Rabbah. The Torah declares, I was the working tool of the Holy One, blessed be He. In human practice, when a mortal king builds a palace, he builds it not with his own skill, but with the skill of an architect. The architect, moreover, does not build it out of his head, but employs plans and diagrams to know how to arrange the chambers and the wicket doors. By the way, this is so parallel to and probably making use of Philo on creation by Philo of Alexandria. Thus Elohim consulted the Torah and created the world, while the Torah declares in the beginning God created, beginning referring to the Torah as in the verse Yahweh made me at the beginning of his way. So there's that interesting passage there from the Midrash Rabbah. And then finally, I want to look here at a prophecy in the book of Enoch, which Paul may also almost certainly has in mind, that Baruch probably has in mind in these passages that we've been looking at. It's 1 Enoch chapter 42, verses 1 through 3. Wisdom found no place where she might dwell. Then a dwelling place was assigned her in the heavens. Wisdom went forth to make her dwelling among the children of men. That's just what Baruch was saying. And found no dwelling place. Wisdom returned to her place and took her seat among the angels. So this is just very much like the idea that Messiah came to the earth, found no place for himself here, wasn't welcomed, and then returned and took his seat among the angels, parallel to Romans 110, sitting at the right hand of Elohim. In Romans chapter 10, 110, in Psalm 110, verses 1 through 4. And unrighteousness went forth from her chambers, whom she sought not she found, and dwelt with them, as rain in a desert, and dew on a thirsty land. So here we have a very similar idea in this concept of wisdom, then coming and dwelling among the children of men. So this is passage, this prophecy by Enoch, is also apparently on the mind of Baruch. It is probably then Baruch, if we take these things in the order in which they were written, if you will, Baruch is interpreting Deuteronomy chapter 30 in light of 1 Enoch 42. Okay, and 1 Enoch 42 having actually been written first, and then Baruch is then bringing these two together and amalgamizing them, and then Paul comes along in Romans chapter 10, and he's making use of all of that to make his case that Yeshua is the Torah, and the Torah is the Messiah, and that Yeshua is therefore the Sakah of the Torah, the sum total of the Torah. Yeshua is the Torah, the Messiah is the Torah, and the Torah is the Messiah, and that the Messiah is then fulfilling these prophecy of Baruch that the Torah would come and dwell among men, which was also fulfilling the prophecy of Enoch chapter 42, 1 Enoch chapter 42, that wisdom would come and dwell among men. So it is very clear when we look at all of this material together, we learn a number of things that we surprise many people. First, we learn that in Romans 10:4, Paul is not saying that Messiah is the end of the law. Paul is beginning to make the case, opening statement to make the case that Messiah is the sum total of the Torah, and that Messiah is the Torah and the Torah is the Messiah. He then quotes two passages from Torah to make his case, and that Paul is also making use of the apocryphal book of Baruch and First Enoch, and bringing those ideas together with Deuteronomy chapter 30 to bolster his case and make the case that if we interpret Deuteronomy chapter 30 in light of the book of Baruch chapter 3 and First Enoch chapter 42, we can understand and learn then that the Messiah is the same as the Torah, and the Messiah is the Torah made flesh. And by the way, all of this then brings us together with Yochanan chapter 1 about the Messiah being the incarnate Word, or the Word made flesh. I hope all of this has helped you to better understand Romans chapter 10 verse 4, and to understand the beautiful truth that the Torah is the Messiah and the Messiah is the Torah, and to also understand that this is one of many places where Paul and the so-called New Testament, the Ketuvim Netzarim, make use of the Apocrypha, the books we know as the Apocrypha, which were frankly taken out of your Bibles, and the First Enoch, the book of Enoch, which is also very important. And so I hope that this study benefits you, and please, again, like this video and subscribe to this channel, and share this video in whatever social networks that you function within. Share it on Facebook with your friends, and share the video with your friends in whatever social media that you engage in. And please donate to support these videos. Where else are you going to find in-depth studies like this that bring material like this together for you? So please consider donating to support this work. And again, you can do that by sending donations to donations@wnae.org. That's wnae.org via PayPal, or by clicking on the link in the video description. All right, until next time, shalom, shalom, everybody.